Hey everyone, this is Mike. Today I wanted to talk a little bit about the Epic of Alexander Ultimate. Since I did clear it last night, I thought it would be a good idea to kind of talk about the fight and give my opinion on some of the things, some of the mechanics, the way the fight works, and that kind of stuff. Now, I'll just go take it phase by phase and then give kind of like an overarching opinion on what I think of the fight. Overall, I think it's a really good fight, and I really enjoyed doing it because it's been so long since we had an Ultimate fight. So it's nice to see one that we have now at current endgame as well. So first of all, Living Liquid, probably an incredibly good phase. What I mean by that is that it immediately throws you in and it doesn't pull its punches. When you took a look at UCOP, you had Twintania, that was so much easier than something like Living Liquid, because in Living Liquid, both of your tanks are tanking a boss. Both of the bosses also have tank busters. Positioning is really important for them as well. When you're baiting certain mechanics, as well as with like the whole getting hit by two of the same debuff, like the water resistance down or the luminous aether plasma, I think it's called. So positioning is really important in phase 1 with all of the different bosses that are on the field, because you have the hand, you have Living Liquid, and then your 4 DPSs are taking care of the Jagged Dolls as well. And then while all of that's going on, you also still have to bait the tornado cleaves. You need to make sure you don't hit people with those cleaves, because if they get hit by two of them, they die. If the tanks get hit by them when they're taking a tank buster, they die. There's also those orbs flying around and that kind of stuff. So it's a very hectic phase, and it immediately throws you in, and it's like, okay, guys, this is an ultimate fight. My group probably struggled the most with this fight. About 60% of all of our wipes doing this entire thing were on Living Liquid. Just because there are so many different things that can go wrong in that phase. I do think we probably wiped a little bit too much on it than we should have. But it is a relatively stressful phase. Like, both of your tanks are tanking, positioning is really important. Your DPS need to learn how to control their DPS as well for the Jack Doll phase. Because if they don't do enough DPS, they wipe the raid, and if they do too much DPS, they also wipe the raid. So it's really important to learn and control how much damage you're doing to those Jagged Dolls before you blow them up, or that you don't do enough damage to them. And then of course your healers is pretty stressful as well, because there's a lot of outgoing AoE damage. Again, they can't always be in the position that they want to be in to AoE heal because of all of these different AoEs going out. And then getting hit by two of them will instantly kill you. And there's just basically a lot of stuff going on, and I think that's a really good thing, because every role has kind of their own stressful thing to do, and their own specific thing that they have to take care of, which is something that you don't always see in fights. So I think it was a really good phase. Now, it's also the first time in an Ultimate that a first phase does not carry on later into the fight. For UCOP, we had of course the Neurolinks that played a very big role for 10 Strike Trio, Felrune Trio, and then also the Ad phase. So the way you positioned those Neurolinks in the first phase was really important later down the line, and how we were going to solve the rest of the mechanics. And then for Ubu, we had Garuda, who had those thermal high stacks, I believe they were called, which were needed to take the Meso high tethers, both in the Garuda phase itself, but then also later down the line in some of the other Ultimates, I believe they were called, basically the trios from Ultima itself. So it was really cool to see that this time around you could just kill Living Liquid and you were basically done with it, because it was pretty fun. But that's not to say that it wasn't that it was too easy, of course. Then our intermission, our transition into phase 2 with the limit cut, something that we again wiped a whole lot of, because again it is really important that you position yourself correctly. You can't go too fast because you'll get hit by an explosion in front of you. You can't go too slow, because then the people that are waiting behind you will get clipped by an explosion that catches up with you. You also need to remember where you need to go. You need to remember your number, and you need to then position yourself correctly so that you don't cleave other people. So I think this is this fight is mainly focused around positioning correctly. I don't think there's ever been a fight that was this heavy on positioning, other than I guess Predation, the initial dodge that most of the people just tank, albeit, and then a little bit of the Annihilation dodges. If you were the tank that was taking the orb during Annihilation from Ultima, that was also pretty tight on movement, but that was only a few short bursts of movement that needed to be perfect, whereas in this Ultimate, in phase 1, but even more specifically in phase 2, precise movement becomes incredibly important. So when we go into Brute Justice and Cruise Chaser, again, there's 2 bosses, so both tanks have something to do. Your healers also need to be really on point with healing both of these tanks, because they're not only taking tank busters, there's also raid-wide AoEs going out. There is a constant dot on like at least 4 people in the party, usually on all 8 through the Nisi. It's not a very severe dot, but it is still there, so it needs to be healed. And there's a bunch of other stuff going out as well, like the mines, the tank, like just the auto attacks from the bosses hit like a truck. And then of course some of the other AoEs that are going out, like the Ice AoE, the flamethrower, that kind of stuff. So again, another phase that has a lot of damage going out, so a lot of healing to be done there. And then of course you also had the Nisis, which was really important that your movement was on point and that you are able to respect other people's movement as well. And usually you had to kind of come up with, when a certain person has a certain debuff, this is going to be their movement, so I will adjust like this. For example, in my group, I give my Thunder debuff to one of the healers, depending on which healer had the water stack in the beginning. But if my Scholar has the water, if I need to pass it to the Scholar, I needed to pass it on the A marker, for example. But when I was going to pass it to the White Mage, I would pass it on the 2 marker, and then once I passed it, she would pass along the edge of the arena next to me, so I would move a little bit more inwards to give her space and that kind of stuff. Just to make sure that our Nisis didn't touch, because Nisi is really important, because you need to keep it alive throughout the whole phase, and then when it comes to the second half of the phase, that's where you pass the Nisi to the correct person, or when you grab it from the correct person, and then you just kind of do your thing there. But you have to be really careful that you don't touch the wrong person, because otherwise if you touch with 2 different Nisis, you wipe the raid. If you grab the wrong Nisi, Gavel will be fucked. So there was a lot of different things that can go wrong in that phase as well, and it's all down to movement. And movement was pretty hectic in that phase as well, because there is a Thunder debuff that needs to be passed around. There are water, like stack markers basically, that need to be soaked. There's mines that need to be soaked. There's the flamethrower, the Ice AoE. All of that stuff is going on, and then of course you also have the shield that you need to break from Cruise Chaser. So the fight or the phase does require a decent amount of movement, but you need to be really careful with just how you move and where you move, because otherwise you're going to clip people and it's going to kill stuff. And if you have 1 death in that phase, and they had the Nisi that you needed, or they lost their debuff, like their Gavel debuff and stuff like that, then it's rip and you can start back over, because you won't be able to get past Gavel, and that will wipe the raid as well. The second, or like the final part of the phase, once Gavel is resolved, it's relatively chill. It's just 2 tank buster, or like a double tank buster that goes out, and then some raid-wide AoEs, and then of course the super jump. But outside of that, the rest of the phase is pretty chill, because we usually had too much DPS as well, so towards the end of the phase we would just hands off the keyboard for 10-15 seconds, just to wait for cooldowns to come back for the big boy, so that we would have no trouble doing that DPS check. Then moving on to Alexander, probably the most underwhelming phase. Well, not necessarily underwhelming phase, but a little bit of a disappointing phase to me, because it's yet another trio phase, and I've kind of had those in, or like I've kind of had my fill of those with the ultimates at this point. But the initial trio is relatively boring. We basically had markers set up so that people would know where to go, and we made the transition or the time stop mechanic as brain dead as possible. We just always had the exact same positioning for everyone. The only people that had to adjust were the ones that had the Thunder debuff, the Aggravated Assault. Those were the only people that had to adjust left or right, depending on where Brute Justice spawned. But other than that, it was a pretty brain dead mechanic, and that's something that I don't really expect it to be in an ultimate. But on the other hand, you just had 2 really hectic phases, so you can kind of stretch, grab a drink, relax a little bit before you go into the next phase. Then Alexander himself, Alexander Prime, is very much like Bahamut, in the sense that there is a little phase where you can do DBS to him, and then you have a phase where he's doing a trio. Inception Formation, probably a little bit too easy, but also because that is the one that gives you the codex. So I guess it was mainly a puzzle to be figured out in that mechanic, rather than the mechanic being really difficult. But all in all, I think Inception still required a decent amount of positioning and like finesse, just so that you can have your crystals in the correct place, and that you make sure that people don't die to the flamethrower AoEs and that kind of stuff. But one thing that I did really like about it is the way how you can use the arena to position yourself correctly. The arena is something that will also come back like earlier on, and you'll see that in my guide as well, if that comes out tomorrow. How you can use the arena to execute a lot of the mechanics, and I think that's a really cool thing, because it can kind of form as a guideline of where you need to place certain AoEs or how you have to do certain things. Of course, after Inception is done, we go into another mini phase of Alexander where he just does a tank buster and that's it. Then we go into Wormhole. Wormhole is probably the hardest mechanic in the whole fight, because it does require all 8 people to be super on point. For example, in Inception, if you have a DPS die, the tank, well, the second tank, can take their position, so it's still salvageable to get through the mechanic. Whereas in Wormhole, if one person dies, it's usually game over, because they won't get their cleave, they won't get their dash, they won't be able to soak the puddle, the stack will have like one person less, meaning that you have to blow mitigation for the stack, which is something that you don't want to do because you need the mitigation for later on. So Wormhole, I think, is a really cool mechanic. When you look at it individually, it's a very simple mechanic because what one person needs to do is not that much. It's usually just like you stand around, you bait a cleave or a dash, and then maybe you soak a puddle, maybe you bait the Brute Justice jump. But when you look at it as a whole and the whole team movement that needs to happen, that is where the mechanic is really difficult. And there are also so many different patterns that you need to learn that the difficulty doesn't come from you as that one person executing the one mechanic that you are given, but you as that one person knowing all of the, what is it, like 16 different possibilities that you can get. So that's where you need to get really used to the mechanic, and that's also why I think it is the main wall point for most of the groups, because it's not just you have 1, 2, or 3 different locations that you can go to, but there's actually like 16 different things that you might have to do through that mechanic. So Wormhole, I think, is an amazing mechanic. I think it was really good. Probably breaks a lot of statics, maybe, if some people aren't able to pick it up, because you do need to learn so much stuff. But that is something that I would call an ultimate mechanic, and time stop is something that I wouldn't. So it's really good to see that there was a very difficult mechanic in that as well. Then after that, instead of tank busters, there's now 2 raid-wide AoEs. And what I think is so cool is that right after these raid-wide AoEs, there's basically a DPS and a severe heal check and mitigation check. So it's basically all coming down to how much mitigation can we not use so that we can save it for the next trio, I guess you could call. I think it's like Judgment Formation or something that it's called. So it's basically like, how little can we use on the 2 Mega Holies so that we can save as much as possible for what comes afterwards, because that is much more important to mitigate through than something like the 2 Mega Holies. Now, we also didn't really have the best kind of comp, I guess you could say, to take care of the mitigation, because we ran Warrior and Paladin. In between the both of them, Paladin, I guess, does have his wings, whatever that's called, Passage of Arms. But that also makes it so that the Paladin can't DPS. So having something like a Dark Knight or a Gunbreaker to bring that like 15-second 10% mitigation whilst they're still able to DPS is incredibly valuable for that phase. But something like Ace buffed to Oblivion Shake It Off, which is what I do towards the end of it, is also really cool to like just mitigate a shitload of damage of one of the higher stacked J-Waves. So Judgment Formation, really cool mechanic when it comes to just being a DPS check and then you being able to layer all of your mitigation so that you mitigate as much as possible, and then just pray that your healers heal enough. And then of course just like meet the DPS check. But outside of that, there's no real mechanic going on. It's more of a DPS slash heal slash mitigation check, I guess you could say. Then moving on into the final phase, which is by far my most favorite final phase of all of the different ultimates. When we looked at Bahamut, we had Golden Bahamut, which was a really cool phase, But mechanic-wise, it was really lackluster. So you had your tank busters, which you just cool down through 2 of them, you mitigate the, and you then invuln the other 2. You had your Morna Fas, which I think was a really cool mechanic because it basically made it so that depending on your team composition, your mitigation was going to look different. So you had to like figure out how you wanted to mitigate all of the Morna Fas so that you wouldn't die to them. So that was a really cool mechanic. And then you had Exa Flares, which again, Exa Flares kind of come back in this fight as well in the form of Trines. But I'll talk about that in just a sec. So Golden Bahamut was really simple and kind of a victory lap. The only thing that made Golden Bahamut really difficult is the stress factor, and that is something that is the same in all of the ultimates. When you get towards the end, when you get close to clearing, that's where stress is going to go up, and that's where people will start making mistakes, not because the mechanics are difficult, but because they're stressing too much. So yeah, and then for Ultima, we just had like the Primal Roulette, that was pretty simple as well. Perfect Alexander, the phase itself as what needs to happen, is also easy. But there's a lot more, and there's actual mechanics that need to happen, and there's really cool mechanics. Basically, the whole phase is about him showing you the future and you changing the future by executing the mechanics correctly, which I think is incredibly cool. It also shows you that you need to respect mechanics like crazy. For example, the Ordained Stillness. We had people die to that even though they stopped like midway through the cast. So if you're progging the fight and you see Ordained Stillness, please go hands off the keyboard as soon as possible, because that thing will kill people a lot if you don't respect that enough. So final phase, really cool. Fate Projection Alpha, probably a little bit too easy, but it's also there to like introduce you to the like calibration mechanic, I guess you could say. Because the way Fate Calibration Alpha works then, like the way, like when it executes the mechanics, it's literally just stand in the safe spot and either you jump or you stand still. So that was relatively simple, but then on the other one, Fate Calibration Beta, that one does have a lot more stuff that you have to pay attention to. Like you need to know if you are light or dark, where you're going to go, who are the beacons, who's baiting the Alexander jumps, which Alexander is going to do the sacrament, and then also if it is spread or stack. So there's a lot of stuff that needed to happen there. We got really lucky on our clear as well because somebody called out the wrong safe spot. So all of the people that did pay attention during it, that were also looking out for the safe spot, they were just like, no, it's this other marker. Which I'll show you that kind of as well in the video tomorrow as well. But yeah, that was kind of a funny thing. But Fate Projection Alpha really easy, Beta a little bit more difficult because there's more stuff that you need to remember. But all in all, the way both of these mechanics like work out is relatively simple. When it comes to the tank busters, they are super easy as well. They're basically 2 different tank busters. One of them is a shared tank buster, which are 3 auto attacks, I guess you could say. And then the 4th hit, which is the second tank buster, is a tank swap. So you need to be stacked together for the initial 3 hits. And then you need to spread out so that you don't hit each other with the physical vuln up, because otherwise you'll die to the auto attacks. But basically you just share the first one, you can invuln the second one, and then you can also invuln the third one if you want to. Now we ended up sharing the third one as well, because we weren't 100% sure of how the timing would work out. But that's kind of why we decided to do it like that, because I'd rather have both me and my Kodank blow some cooldowns on it, and then make sure that we survive, rather than me just try to solo it and fuck up my timing for my home gang. Because all of the like home gang and Superb Light is not long enough to cover all of the tank busters. It's only long enough to like cover, I think it's 2 auto attacks and then the final hit or something like that. But we haven't really figured out the timing for that, so instead of trying to figure out the timing and have potentially cost vibes, we just decided to share it instead. Then the Exa Trine mechanic, I think was really cool. The only thing that I think is a little bit too easy, maybe. Personally, I think it's easier than Exa Flares, because once you know the pattern, because there is a set and a fixed pattern to how they work, it's just which one spawns first, second, and third that is different. So once you know the patterns, it's really easy to just decide on we're gonna dodge it here, and then you just adjust to the one of the 4 different locations that you're going to be standing in. Because basically there is a square in the middle of the arena that will always give you a 3-to-1 dodge, and if you know that, the mechanic actually becomes really simple. Now, as you can see in our clear video, we also had markers to help out with that as well, so people that weren't paying attention to it could use the markers to dodge it. But in general, I don't really think you need those markers, because all you need to do is you need to know which one explodes first, and you need to know which one explodes last, and then you just go stand on the last one, and you move into the first one. It's always a straight line. Either you're going to be dodging like horizontally, or you're going to be dodging vertically. There's no diagonal dodges going on, so it's really simple on how that mechanic resolves. But again, just like with Exa flares, it's a really stressful thing, because if you get hit by it, you die, and there is a follow-up stack right after that needs all of your people alive and a crap load of mitigation. So you do want to have all of your people alive to dodge that Exa Shrine. Of course, there's another Tank Buster, and then there's a second set of Exa Shrines. So yeah, all in all, really cool phase. The Enrage itself, pretty cool as well. It just like completely stops time, and then he just sends you back to the beginning. It doesn't even kill you. He just loads you back into Living Liquid. So I think that was a really cool thematical thing, with the fact that Alexander is like the ruler of time. So he just sends you back in time to the beginning of the fight, rather than kill you, wipe you, and then the fight restarts on itself, because that's how the game works. So yeah, all in all, pretty cool phase. Final phase is definitely my favorite one, even though it is relatively simple. But then on the other hand, the final phase is always supposed to be a victory lap, and I really think that it did make it easy enough for it to be a victory lap, but the mechanics that were there were still punishing enough for it to be considered an ultimate victory lap. So all in all, I think Alexander Ultimate is probably one of my favorites. I'm a little bit disappointed with the fact that they have yet another trio phase with like the third boss and like the 2 other bosses that show up. I'd really like to see something different happen with the next Ultimate. But the trios that like existed were still good enough. And it's also not like with Bahamut, where you have like, 5 different trios or something like that. It was only the 3 of them, and the only real trios that we had were Inception and then Wormhole, which Wormhole was really good. So I think all in all, fight is really good. It's a really hard Ultimate, because there is so much like stuff that just can go wrong, and on certain phases it's also really difficult to recover from somebody dying. Whereas back on, say for example, Twintania or Nail, you could have somebody die and it'd still be fine. Whereas in this phase, if you have somebody die with a Nisi, it's game over. If somebody dies during the Protean waves or something, you're gonna lose more people as well. So it's a really cool fight. I think if you've cleared E4 Savage, definitely give it a try. Even if you don't manage to clear it, I think you should definitely try it out. Because the fight is really cool, and it will definitely make you a better player if you do attempt it. So that's pretty much going to be it for me. Ended up going a little bit longer than I expected it to be. But yeah, I want to thank you for watching if you're still here. And I'll see you tomorrow, hopefully, when I bring out that guide for the fight. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.